Morning, everyone, and you're very welcome to this webinar, Hearing Hidden Voices, Older Victims of Domestic Abuse. My name's John Devaney. I'm Professor of Social Work at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session this morning. We've got two fantastic speakers who are going to be talking around different aspects of how we understand and also respond to the needs of older victims of domestic violence and abuse. We've around 200 people who have booked on to the event today, so we're delighted that you're all able to join us, both in terms of participating in listening to both Elizabeth and Rebecca, but also hopefully in being able to participate in some of the discussion that we'll have afterwards. Just to inform you all, we're recording the event today, so it will be available to participants afterwards. But just to let you know that through being part of the event today, that we are making a record of it. Many thanks to the British Society of Gerontology, who are sponsoring the event today. What that really means is that if we had to be meeting in person, they would have been paying for the coffee and biscuits. But since we're online, we're all having to do that ourselves. But we're really grateful for the Society for actually agreeing to host the event and recognizing the importance of these issues. Also very grateful to Paula Devaney and ARK at Queen's University Belfast for hosting the webinar and running all of the technical bits in the background. Format of the webinar is that we have two speakers who both speak for approximately 20 minutes each, and they'll follow one another, and then we'll have a time towards the end for probably around 25 minutes of Q&A or discussion about the issues. If you do want to pose any questions or offer any comments or reflections on what you've heard, please use the chat function. I'll keep an eye on that, and then when sort of both Elizabeth and Rebecca have finished their presentations, I'll start drawing upon those comments, reflections, and questions as a way of going back to both Elizabeth and Rebecca and having a discussion about the points that you're raising. Your microphones and cameras, I think, are off at the moment, so you'll not be able to sort of ask questions, I don't think, in that sense, but please do use the chat function as a way of interacting, and hopefully other people can also respond in the chat function as well. Now, this seminar or webinar has been set up to really start to explore an issue that's been gaining greater recognition over recent years, in that we have a better understanding about both the numbers of older citizens who are experiencing domestic abuse, but also a greater understanding of the impact that that has had, whether or not the domestic abuse is something which they've lived with for many years and decades, or whether it's something new. But also we're getting much better at understanding how to respond at both an individual and societal level. And I think both presentations today will be drawing out different aspects of these issues, and hopefully they'll complement one another in a way that allows us to sort of both see the bigger picture in terms of how we need to respond as a society, as well as thinking about what are the lived experiences of individuals and how do we try and ensure that people are supported in these circumstances. Our first speaker today is Dr. Elizabeth Martin. I've had the pleasure of knowing Elizabeth for quite a few years, and Elizabeth's a lecturer in social policy at Queen's University in Belfast. She's also a member of the ARK Ageing team and the Northern Ireland branch of the British Society of Gerontology. Elizabeth has particular interest in researching marginalised populations and in giving a voice to the more vulnerable members of society. Her PhD explored how the intersection of domestic abuse, ageing, gender, and substance abuse has contributed to this population being hidden within society, even though we know that they're there. She's currently part of an advisory group for the Older But No Safer campaign run by Antrim, Ballymena, Carrickfergus, Larne, and Newton Abbey Women's Aid. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation, Elizabeth, so I'll hand over to you here.
Thanks, John. I'll just share my screen here. There we go. So my presentation this morning, I'm going to be talking about the work that I did for my PhD. And it's very much about the individual, the lived experiences of women who've been victims of domestic abuse. Just a quick infographic there. If you look, the majority of research is on younger women and sort of women of childbearing or childbearing age. But as John says, we're only really now starting to properly understand the experiences of older women. The issue was as women get older, as you can see there, the number of instances of domestic abuse are recorded are actually, they do drop. But as women get older, then they start to rise again, and it's that sort of population that my study was focused on. There was some previous research conducted here in Northern Ireland, and John was part of that as well. And this sort of gave a springboard for my research. But what they found was that they talked to a small group of older women who'd been victims of domestic abuse. And what they found, that most of the women had experienced domestic abuse throughout their lives, and that is replicated in my research. They also find that older women, excuse me, are less likely to seek help. Older people as a group in general, they're the group less likely to report crimes, and older women are even less likely. And if you think about how hidden domestic abuse is, it's really difficult for them to come forward. And this study also found that psychological abuse had the strongest impact on their physical and mental health. Now we have new laws coming in about coercive control and new crimes, and this is what happens in older couples that while sorry, excuse me, just take a drink. The violence in older couples tends to reduce as they get older, but the psychological abuse continues, and says that studies find this has a major impact on people. So these are the participants. Obviously, I've changed their names and I've changed details so they can't be recognised. But it took me a year to find these 6 women. All of them spoke to me. They all said that they wanted to help because they didn't want to see other women in the same position that they were. If you look at these, you see they range from 1 long-term relationship, some of them, 2, 3, and up to 4 with Alison. He had 4 different abusive relationships. So all of the women that I spoke to had been in violent relationships from a very young age. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to explore some of the issues that they experience. I'm going to be using the women's words themselves. The first one I'm going to talk about is Carla. Now, Carla, she was 62 whenever I spoke to her, and her husband had actually passed away 2 years previously. Well, Carla first met him whenever she was 14. He was a lot older than her. He didn't like her going to school because he loved her and he wanted to spend time with her. So at 15, Carla actually ended up in hospital. She had a miscarriage. She didn't understand what was happening to her. She went to hospital, she had a miscarriage, and she rang her mother and told her what had happened, asked her mum to pick her up, and her mum put the phone down on her. That she was disgusted at Carla's behaviour, getting pregnant at 15. Then Carla ended up, actually, whenever she did come home from hospital, her father, she's described how her father took her by the scruff and took her to the priest's house to confess her sins. So Carla ended up being sort of pushed into marriage at 17. And she told me about the wedding. The thing that sticks out in my mind was putting my wedding dress on, and I had wee sleeves down to here, and I was pulling them down so that no one could see that I have bruises on both my arms from where he had nipped me. So even on our wedding day, she was walking up the aisle with signs of abuse on her. She was convinced, though, that sure, once we're married, he'll settle down, he'll trust me, the violence will stop, I can always leave. And this didn't happen. Say Carla was with him up until she was 60 and he had passed away. A key issue that came across whenever I was speaking to the woman was the issue of isolation. I'll read this out. He organised to go and see this house where we're living now. We moved there and I wasn't happy. It was in the middle of nowhere. Whenever we were buying the house, he made me sell my car for the deposit. So Dorinda, not only was she away from close friends and family members, she told me this house was down at the bottom of a wee lane. You needed to have a car to get to and from it. Of course, she sold her car and she never got her car back again. So she talked about how she lived there. She was totally on her own. And in fact, on occasions, he locked her into the house in case she did decide to walk and to go somewhere. So she was totally isolated from whenever they were married. And Carla says, I remember waiting on him coming home from his job. He came first and that was it. You know, as long as he was all right, then the rest of us, her and the children, would be okay. Carla worked, but she only went to work and straight back again. She couldn't spend time with friends. She couldn't go out for coffee. She couldn't go out shopping on her own because she had to be there for him whenever he came home. If she didn't, then he became violent. And Carla said, even though whenever I spoke to her at this stage, her husband passed away, she says, I have a couple of good friends. I have one friend that I can sort of tell so much to, but I have another friend, she's good, but I can't confide in her at all. Even now, I'm feeling all right telling you this, but I couldn't sit down and talk to her about what happened. So even though she wasn't in the relationship anymore, her husband had passed away, he couldn't do her any more harm, she was still frightened of him and she was still very much ashamed of what she'd gone through. And she couldn't share it even with close friends. One friend that she can tell a bit to, but other friends she couldn't talk to at all. The woman talked about the problems they'd had finding help. I mean, these women have been in abusive relationships 20, 30, 40 years. Emily said, I didn't know who to turn to. She had no idea where to go for help. And Frances said, I tried going to my doctor, but couldn't bring myself to ask for help. Women who've been in relationships, long-term relationships, it takes a while to build up the trust with them. They're not going to open up straight away. Even though Frances knew her GP, anytime she went, she said he was very busy. He just didn't have time, and she couldn't bring herself to ask for help. And something that I found actually really interesting, some women didn't know about Women's Aid. They didn't know it existed. They didn't know that there was help out there for them. Alison did, and Alison, although she said, I volunteered with Women's Aid when I was younger, but it never even came into my mind to go to them when I was older and needed help. The woman that I did speak to that knew about Women's Aid, they all repeated this, Women's Aid, that's for younger women. That's not for us. That's for women and children. It's not for older women such as yourselves. Carla went to see a solicitor for help at one stage. She wasn't ready to leave, but she just wanted to know what the situation would be if she did. So she said, I went to a solicitor just to find out if I did leave, my rights and everything else. And she said, oh, you need to leave. And then a few weeks later, she sent me a bill to my house. Carla had told her, Carla said she was very open with this solicitor about what was happening, what was going on, the violence that she was experiencing. But it still didn't register with the solicitor that it would be harmful for Carla to receive a letter. Obviously, her husband controlled everything that came into the house and he opened the letter. So Carla did go for help a little later on, but it was a long, long time. Women also in the study, they protected others. Frances here was protecting her abuser's mum. So she said, he just picked me up and banged my head against the wall and my face was black and blue the next day. So I went to the hospital. I went to hospital because I was worried and they asked me to please get the police. But I promised his mum that I wouldn't get the police. Frances's husband had been in trouble with the police before and he had major issues with, he beat another woman, he'd got into fights, and his mum had told Frances that if he got into trouble with the police again that he'd be arrested. So Frances she put up with the violence, she put up with the abuse to protect his mother. She was very close to his mum. Alison as well, she spoke about how her husband's mother, she was an elderly lady and she came to visit one time, and Alison was really worried that his mum would think badly of her, that she would think that she wasn't looking after her son. So I just had this feeling that he maybe be saying bad things to you about me. And I want you to know I've always looked after him. So again, she was protecting his mother. She didn't tell the mother about the abuse, although Alison suspected that he was abusive to his mother as well. But she was protecting the mother. Brenda was introduced to me by a caseworker in Women's Aid, and Brenda had major issues with alcohol. And whenever her caseworker introduced me, she says, Brenda's doing really well. She hasn't had a drink in a long time. She's off the drink now. It's great. But Brenda, whenever she spoke to me, she said, she was talking about the caseworker, and she said, she's such a lovely woman. I'm so proud of me. I can't let her down. Brenda was, spoke to me, and she was saying she was drinking again, and she was drinking very heavily. But she said, the caseworker, she doesn't really need to know, does she? She was more worried. If Brenda had went back to her caseworker and said, look, I'm having problems with alcohol again, can you help me? She didn't want to let her down. She was ashamed of what she was doing. So there was a service there, and she was engaged with the service to help, but she wasn't open with them. She was more worried about protecting her caseworker and getting help for herself. Carla was still protecting her daughter. Carla had 2 daughters, and she was convinced whenever they were growing up that they hadn't seen the full extent of the violence. So now her daughters are adults, but she still tries to protect them. Her daughter noticed that she was going to Women's Aid, and Carla said, and she asked her, what are you doing? Why are you going there? I don't understand. But Carla said, it's just wee courses. She talked about aromatherapy courses, things like that come up. And I just make it up when I go along. It's difficult, but I don't want her to know like the extent of it. I says, oh, no, it's all good stuff. I put the face on when I go home, when inside I just want to scream. The way I did this study was biographical narrative method, but what I did was I explained to the participants, this is what I was doing. I asked them one single question at the start of it, and put the control of the interview situation in their hands, so they could start when they wanted, they could finish when they wanted, they could tell me their story, and just pull out stuff that they wanted me to hear about. As I said, all the women I spoke to had been to Women's Aid, so they'd all told their story, their basic story before, and they all told this at the start of the interview. It was like almost like a rote learned, they knew it was the same story, and then they came to the end, and this is whenever all this information came out, the fact that they were protecting other women, they were protecting the abusers' mothers. A lot of this I struggled to find in literature beforehand, but this is what came out through the interviews. It also came up with age, actual age of women themselves was a barrier to accessing help. Alison spoke about a time whenever she was in like a group session in Women's Aid, and she said, because I'm older, I feel as if I really should have known better, but better just to keep on brushing it under the carpet and keep covering it up. It's the shame that's attached to it is unbelievable, especially when surrounded by much younger women. I just couldn't speak up in front of them. So Alison was there. She talked about how in all the sessions she was the oldest by at least 20 years. And she found it so difficult to speak to the younger woman, to share her experiences with them. As well. Sure, they were all the young ones. They saw me as a mommy figure, came to me for advice. I couldn't let them down and tell them I was struggling as much, if not more than they were. She, Brenda said she was, part of the reason why she didn't speak to the younger woman was she didn't want to frighten them. Sorry, Brenda, she told me about one time she found out she was pregnant, and he kicked her to the floor and stood with his boot on her face until she said that she would go and have an abortion. Brenda was always also, she was embarrassed that these younger women, she said these younger women had escaped from the abuse, whereas she had had it for years and years and years. So she felt stupid, she said, about talking about her experiences, because they'd all got out and she remained there, she couldn't leave. Alison talked about getting older. It's almost as if you disappear off people's radar as you get older. Before you realise that you're on your own. slowly start to disappear from media, from advertising, from sort of billboards, things like that, as they get older, and women in particular tend to disappear. Well, people feel are. So, as if you're an older woman, you're pushed aside, you've done your job, you brought your child up, that's it. And that's why Alison felt as if she just wasn't worth anything anymore. Carla went to her doctor, and her doctor said, my doctor says you're not angry with him. He says, I'm angry with myself for putting up with it. Another thing that came out through my research was some of the women didn't actually realise that they were in abusive relationships until they'd escaped it. Some spoke about it wasn't violence, but it was all control. They controlled what they were, where they went, where they could go, who they could speak to. And they, because they'd experienced this from a young age, from their late teens, early 20s, they thought this was normal. A couple of them had gone to their parents whenever they were younger and talked to them about the abuse. And they're basically told, well, you're married now, you can make your bed, lie in it, sure, it's not that bad. And then as they get older and they maybe speak to relatives or children or family members, say, oh, sure, you've been up with it for this long. Surely if you've been up with it for this long, it's not that bad. So Carla was more angry with herself for actually staying there than she was with her husband for the abuse. The woman also spoke about wanting to be loved. Alison said, I really want to have another relationship. I want to have that respect and, look after each other. And Brenda said, it's not that easy because I do love him. It's the way that he treats me. So they still wanted to be in the relationships. They just wanted the abuse and the violence to stop. There's also an issue there too, whenever while they're in the relationship, they have that little bit of power there. They can behave as I taught it. They can do what they want. They do what's expected of them. If you know about the cycle of violence, you can see violence starting to build up and then it explodes and then it settles down again. They talked about this while they were in the relationship, they had this little bit of control. Whereas if they went to ask for help, then that control would be gone. They were worried that if they went to ask for help, that social services, the doctors would get involved and then the violence would actually get worse and they would lose the control they had. Because access and support, a lot of they couldn't have spoken any more highly of Women See It. Frances said, I would know who I am now to Women See It, I think, because I might still be going round and round in circles, going crazy. Although they did have issues talking to the younger women in it, if they had caseworkers or they formed relationships, some women say it, in fact, the one I'm working with at the moment, the Older Women Safer Group, they have specific case workers in now for older women. And peer support for these women was vital. They couldn't speak to the younger woman, but if they had a caseworker or if they were able to go to a group with other older women there who experienced the same, that made such a difference. They were able to open up to them. They felt they weren't being judged. They didn't feel ashamed. They were able to speak openly about their experiences. Brenda said, I came to Women See It because I needed somebody to, my head was nearly away. I don't know where to go or who to talk to or what to do. My doctor told me about Women See It and I thought, they will listen to me. Brenda had spoken to some family members, but as I said, she was told, I'm sure, if he was that bad, why are you still there? Or else just pick up your bags and leave, and it's that simple. But it's really not that simple. All the women talked about the long-term impact of abuse. Brian said, someday I'm just going to lose the plot, just disappear. I'm thinking about it. Everything just seems to be a fight every day. Brenda, her husband lived with her, but her husband's mother actually lived there as well. And they were both, Brenda said, they treated her like a skippy. She didn't have any control over her own life. She was constantly running about that after them. If she didn't, it was a fault. Carla said, I would say I'm doing pretty well, trying to look after myself, but it can still get back into my head again. I can feel it physically. Carla spoke to me. She said the morning before she came for the first interview, she said, I heard him coughing. I woke up this morning and I heard him coughing. Now, this man had passed away 2 years ago, but he still had that. He was ill for a long time. She was his carer. And he kept saying, she said, the violence stopped. She said, well, all you have to do is give her that look. And she just, but she said she was terrified of him, and she was convinced that he was still there, he was still watching her. And she was annoyed with herself because she felt he still had some sort of control over her. During the set, I remember somebody saying to me, you know, what was your personality like before the abuse started? And she said, I don't know. And I really don't know. So it's just taking every day as it comes. If you've been in a relationship 20, 30, 40 years, something simple like watching, she didn't know what her favorite programs were on the TV because she couldn't watch anything that she liked. He controlled what she wore, he controlled what she ate, where she did. So she didn't know. And she had to find this out. So just to sum up, many older women are aware of services which are available to them. Some older women are unable to recognise abuse until they've actually left the relationship. And this is part of the reason why I organised this webinar. Much more conversations need to take place, both amongst professionals, but also society as a whole. The more we talk about this, the more we bring it into the public domain, and the more maybe women in that relationship, in this sort of relationship, realise that there is help out there. So given the right support with time and patience, the lives of these women can be improved. And I'm just going to finish up now. I started with a quote from Carla, and this is one. I spoke to Carla, it was just before Christmas, and we were finishing up on the interviews. And she said, I have a wedding coming up soon, and I brought this dress. I've always said I wanted like a red dress, which I was never allowed to wear. So my daughter sent an order me a red dress, and it's beautiful. And Carla's whole face just lit up. And she said, you know, she was like a child going to a toy shop. And said, I'm thinking like, I'm actually going to be able to wear this, and nobody's going to say that it's too tight, that it's too low, if you're not wearing that. All of the participants that came and spoke to me, I was able to give them just a small token of appreciation, of thanks for, because it's a long process interviews. And I give this to Carla, it's £20. And Carla said, well, what do I do with this? I said, well, it's up to you, whatever you want. She said, so maybe you should give it to Women's Aid. I said, Carla, what about you put it towards a pair of shoes to go with that dress? And then she started crying. Carla still has a long way to go, but she's getting there. And as a society, we're all responsible for what's going on, but these women's lives can be changed. So, thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. That's a really powerful presentation, all the more so because of the direct quotes from the participants in your research, and to hear the words of the women themselves, both the experiences that they were living through, the impact it was having on them, but also the hopefulness that with the right support, women can start to feel safer and also can start that journey of recovery from what they've been through. And I'm sure we'll return to some of these themes as we go along this morning. I should have mentioned at the beginning that for those who are on Twitter, we're using the hashtag hidden voices to be able to sort of both share some of the themes that are coming up with those who aren't able to join us today, but also to have a parallel discussion to the one that might be taking place in the chat function as well. Again, please do post questions or comments or reflections in the chat function. We will have time at the end of Rebecca's presentation to come back and pick up on some of the themes that both Elizabeth and Rebecca are presenting on. Very pleased now to be able to welcome and introduce Rebecca Zerk. Rebecca is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Age, Gender and Social Justice at Aberystwyth University, and she's also the Research Project Manager for the Dewis Choice Initiative, which we'll be talking about today. Dewis Choice offers the first dedicated service for older men and women who experience domestic abuse, inclusive of those living with dementia and those who identify as LGBT+. I know a little bit about the Dewis Initiative, but not enough. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation, Rebecca, and I'll hand over to you now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss this very important issue. We've been working on the Dewis Choice Project since 2015, and the initiative is based at the Centre for Age, Gender and Social Justice at Aberystwyth University. The initiative is very unique in that it combines both research with a co-produced service designed by local communities. And you can visit our website for further details about the initiative and what it is we're doing. Today, I'm going to share findings with you from the longitudinal and qualitative study over a 5-year period, which examines the help-seeking and justice-seeking journeys of older people. And our sample includes older women, men, those who identify as LGBTQ+, or those living with dementia, and anybody really over the age of 60 years. But today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the lived experiences of women aged 60 years and older. Our sample ranges from the age of 60 to 93 years old, and the swelling tends to be at the ages between 75 and 80. With a mixture of long-term domestic violence, new relationships in later life, and then the domestic abuse occurring, or the abuse beginning or escalating at the point of retirement or later life. Contrary to societal belief, domestic abuse in later life is a significant and under-recognised phenomenon that has a wide-ranging impact on the lives of older people. It is estimated that roughly 1/3 of a million of older people living within their own homes are subject to some form of mistreatment, with the majority being perpetrated by adult family members or intimate partners. However, the true extent of the problem largely remains unknown, and this is due to widespread underreporting and underrecording of abuse of older people. Some studies indicate that there is this confusion between what constitutes as domestic abuse and what constitutes as elder abuse. And in practice, this is really problematic because the discourse around elder abuse is very ageist and discriminatory, and can really mask some of those power and control dynamics that feature within domestic abuse relationships. And although there are similarities, older people's experiences of domestic abuse are markedly different from younger people, and these differences haven't typically been adequately accounted for or acknowledged within the literature. So Dr. Elizabeth Martin provided like a historical context of the women's experiences of abuse, and looked very much about that kind of individual and interpersonal level barriers, highlighting that shame, self-blame, embarrassment, potential fear of repercussions are kind of some of the key barriers to access and help and support. And these have really been echoed within our own findings, especially around that internalised responsibility for the abuse. And unfortunately, we've seen many examples where these beliefs and attitudes have been reinforced by people when individuals have sought help from somebody, either formal networks or informal networks. So my presentation today is going to very much be focused on the more organisational and structural barriers that influence older women's help seeking and their justice seeking journeys. Okay, so older people as potential victims of domestic abuse are overlooked. They often fall outside of that public story of who is a domestic abuse victim. Our review highlighted that typically it's a white, middle-class, heterosexual female under the age of 70 years old with young families. And there's very limited discussion on the ethnic diversity. And this has significant implications for both older people identifying themselves as victims, but also for practitioners when recognising that domestic abuse in later life is an issue. And this invisibility is really reflected in research, in policy, and in practice, particularly when compared to the peripheral of policy guidance, service development, and professional training that is tailored towards other age groups. And it's only recently that it's been gaining political attention. Although we are seeing that there is an increase in the media and publicity of older people, These images that project later life are typically ageist. You see the gnarled hands, or the head in hands in the head kind of image. So older people are absent in these imagery, and they don't really reflect the diversity of later life, spanning across those 3 generations. Generic services and support groups have been criticised for not meeting the needs of older people, concentrating on issues such as child custody or job training. And although these are really important issues for younger people, they're not always important for older people in later life. So given the lack of voices of older people in research, there has been this tendency for researchers, policymakers, and activists to assume those justice aspirations of older people experiencing domestic abuse. And we've really seen examples of this within our own study, ageist examples. So for example, a woman has visited a solicitor to request that she petitions for a divorce, and then they're advised that a divorce is probably not the best route for them and they should opt for separation instead. Now, this wouldn't happen for somebody who is maybe in their 30s or 40s. However, because of the lady's age, this was the response that she had received. In addition, we've seen an example where a grandmother was reporting to the police for abuse from her granddaughter. And when asked if she wanted to press charges and go to court, she'd responded no. In an attempt to be quite sympathetic towards the victim, the police officer responded and said, yeah, I wouldn't want to punish my granddaughter either. Now, the reality for the victim was that actually she was fearful of attending to court. She had this projection of what court would be, quite like how you see it in the media and on the TV. And she didn't really know what it would entail. So, and in an attempt to be quite sympathetic towards her, what the officer actually did was instill further fears for her around how her family and the wider community would perceive her for criminalising her granddaughter. So to begin, I thought it would be useful for us to actually define what we mean by help seeking. And what this means for the older women that engage within the Dewis Choice Project. Unsurprisingly, from what we've heard, currently our understanding of help seeking is based on white middle class women. And yes, there may be similarities there, but there are also differences and challenges that older people face. So research examining help seeking is typically collected retrospectively. It's typically at a single juncture in time, for example, at first disclosure or at the point of maybe going to court. And usually involves actually speaking to somebody and disclosing about that abuse. And what we've done on the Dewis Choice Project is actually follow that victim's journey throughout a 3 to 5 year period, from the point where they've disclosed to an organisation, right up until the point where they're post-recovery or they're in the recovery phase. And they may have gone through that justice-seeking journey. And when I say justice, I mean this in a loose sense in terms of what that individual perceives as justice, whether that's on an individual level or on a community level or on a state level there. So research, we know that from our study that older women have engaged in private strategies to seek help. So they may listen to podcasts, they may attend libraries and read self-help books. And for those who may not be technically savvy, they've described the difficulty of having to actually vocalize to someone that they think that they're experiencing abuse or that something's not quite right. And this may be quite different to younger groups of people where they may be more inclined to use the internet and to search for information online. The women described the difficulty they had of trying to actually articulate 40 or 50 years of abuse and just not knowing where to begin. They'd said how they'd tried to tell people indirectly by saying things like, oh, well, he's a bit of a control freak, or through unspoken disclosures. So when people would make comments about the perpetrator, they didn't respond. But these types of disclosures were never really picked up on, and the abuse remained hidden as a result of this. Our research evidence is that the help-seeking journey is continuous, it's ongoing, and individuals may have multiple goals and priorities that change over the course of time. And this really supports the work of Holder and Daly, which shows that meanings of justice are fluid, justice goals shift and change throughout that victim's journey. And that help-seeking process is not linear. It's not, moving forward all the time. It's moving backwards and forwards in the recovery, in the decision-making. And women described how they felt that services were frustrated by this, and were considered inconsistent or time-wasting for wanting to change their mind about different decisions regarding their justice and help-seeking. A strong theme that emerged was how difficult it was for women to recall the information when they were dealing with trauma, and how this conflicted with what criminal justice organisations' goals were. So the women described the criminal justice process demanding the victim to recall lots of information without them really having sufficient time to digest the question or to think that through. And there was a real conflict between a victim's strong desire to have those experiences validated and believed when telling their story, but also feeling that they were constantly being challenged or having pressure on them to get things right. We've had examples where women became really obsessive over paperwork, writing everything down or holding on to every bit of information, as they felt frightened that they would be tripped up or caught out for not remembering everything. And when this did happen, they said it instilled feelings of self-blame, and they were deemed to be considered not a good witness, and that the perpetrator got away with what he'd done because of their actions of not performing that ideal victim. So often the process of taking a statement or conducting a risk assessment is quite an extraction process, whereby the victim is expected to recall many years of abuse and to disclose to someone that they've just met quite personal experiences. Our data from the victim interviews and from practitioner case notes revealed that the victim survivors disclose their experiences incrementally, only disclosing aspects of the victimization. And this allowed them really to test the waters, to retain control over that decision making, and to develop a trust with that agency or that practitioner. So once that trust had been established, and the victim felt safe to be able to give more information, they would be more forthcoming in their experiences. We've had examples where it's been 6 months down the line where no forms of a specific form of abuse was not disclosed, and then after a period of time that it was. So depending on how safe and how control in those decision makings that individual feels will depend on how much is actually shared. We've seen examples where there was no disclosure of access to firearms or to sexual abuse. And this really reflects the need for more dynamic risk assessments that are conducted with practitioners and that individual, and to revisit those at different stages throughout that individual's journey. So our previous research findings highlighted that older victims of abuse were not always central to the decision-making process. Our Access to Justice study found that in our sample of 135 cases, that 2/3 of those cases, an older person's decision was not sought regarding what they wanted in terms of the outcome of that case. We saw examples of well-meaning practitioners acting on behalf of the older person based on that individual's perceived vulnerability. And our research really identified that for victim survivors who lacked capacity, they were most likely to experience discrimination by services. typically, older victims were diverted away from a specialist domestic abuse response and diverted more towards a welfare approach that prioritised their health needs. And for us, this was a fundamental violation of their human rights to access justice and to be involved in decisions that affect their lives, leading to discriminatory practices and in cases increasing harm. And then we also carried out another piece of work for the Older People's Commissioner for Wales. This was looking at 22 local authorities across Wales and the 4 regional police forces in the criminal justice response. And we were gathering practitioners' perspectives of the barriers that older people face when seeking help and support. And what we found was that, and this really echoed some of the larger findings from Safe Lives, was that an older person was just as likely to experience abuse from an adult family member as they were an intimate partner. And that's been reflected in our sample on the Dewis Choice project also. We saw that the practitioners' views were that they were more likely to stay living with the harmer or maintaining a relationship with the person who was causing them harm for longer periods of time. That typically older people weren't accessing services, whether they were statutory or third sector, and when they were, it was typically to seek help for the perpetrator rather than for themselves. And there was also the perception that the meanings of the home, the family, were really important to that older person, and they acted as significant barriers for them coming forward and accessing help and support. And our findings working directly with older women actually debunk some of these myths, and that we found that with the right support and with an empowerment approach, that the majority of women did wish to leave the intimate partner that was causing them harm, or they didn't wish to maintain a relationship with that abusive child or grandchild. And we actually saw that it was less about those intrinsic vulnerabilities of that individual and their own characteristics, for example, them being frail or dependent or age-related, that inhibited their help seeking. Although they were factors in the initial disclosure, at the point of formal disclosure, those were no longer the things that were significantly impacting on their help seeking. It was more around those extrinsic vulnerabilities, so a lack of appropriate service provision, not creating enabling environments, which really increased that risk of harm. So for us, we saw on an institutional and organisational level that there were many barriers. First and foremost, not being recognised as domestic abuse when it had occurred in later life. And this was particularly the case where dementia or abuse from an adult family member occurred. Domestic abuse was often confused with carer's stress, where the abuse was considered a single incident rather than a pattern of abusive behaviour or a medical symptom that was potentially associated with older age. And so signs of coercive control were often missed, or they were guised under conjugal roles, which assumed these prescribed roles. So it was quite typical that men looked after the finances and women maintained the family home, which is fine if that's what's agreed between the couple. But most of the time, the women described how these decisions were taken out of their control and they weren't allowed to engage in certain activities that the male was able to do. So it was very much about that control over that individual's life. They were unable to disclose because they described having very limited opportunities for disclosure. Increased isolation in later life also meant limited opportunities for that disclosure. Older people typically have people come to their home to visit them rather than going out and seeing people. So again, if the perpetrator was living with them, that is quite difficult for them. But they said that they wanted to be asked. They didn't know how to start that conversation, but if somebody had asked them, they would have told them. And this is something that doesn't typically happen. We do see routine inquiry with younger age groups, but we don't necessarily with older people. They describe those kind of initial reactions, shutting down their disclosures. So when they tried to explain to someone about the perpetrator's behaviour, the response was, well, how did it come to this at your age? How have you got yourself into this situation at your age? And that instilled those kind of self-blame, embarrassment feelings. There's ageist and paternalistic responses that we've seen and got evidence of throughout the data where practitioners circles, within those practitioner circles, which really impacted on people's likelihood to engage. Victim survivors described how they thought that there was some sort of professional conspiracy when they were asking for help and they weren't being believed, they weren't being listened to, or they weren't responded to on account of the judgment of their characteristics or their position within society. And as a consequence, the victim was harmed through inappropriate action or inaction of practitioners and harmed through kind of sexist or ageist assumptions. Organisations' goals often run counter to what the individual wanted, and people's everyday practices were often coloured by these practitioners' own prejudices or discriminatory practices. There was a sense from talking to our older clients that they were not only being coerced by the perpetrator, but also by professionals who were intent on fulfilling their own organisational objectives, whilst dismissing their own voice and choice and not sufficiently exploring their rights, entitlements and needs. We also saw this rule of optimism, which the Older People's Commissioner for Wales talks about, where practitioners sometimes place undue confidence on the capacity of family members to provide effective care for their loved ones. However, this certainly wasn't the case for all of them. We definitely saw coercive and controlling behaviours. We definitely saw examples that were initially perceived as coercive control, but when we spoke directly, as caregiver stress, but when we spoke directly to the person, we could see that there was a pattern of long-term abuse there. And then older perpetrators were perceived to be less dangerous based on their perceived frailty and vulnerability that was associated with later life. And this often led to less punitive responses. Women felt that there was a more sympathetic response towards the perpetrator. And the perpetrators seemed to be fully aware of their presentation to services and use this to their advantage. However, we know from the data that close body contact in providing care increases the risk of harm and increases the dependency. And we also know from domestic homicide reviews that when an individual reaches near death, the risk can escalate. Murder-suicide appears to be more prevalent in later life. And we know that 1 in 4 domestic homicides involve a person over the age of 60, and that is the fastest rise in victimisation rate per head of population. And this is really then reflected in that perpetrators rarely face conviction. So just to quickly go through, because I'm aware of the time, in terms of what people can do to enable a positive help-seeking experience, it is really creating that space and time away from the perpetrator. We've seen where they've been away from the perpetrator for a long period of time, reflecting on the options that are presented to them has really given them that time and space to think about what it is that they want. Time to give the historical context of that abuse and what has happened to them. Our support workers have said how they've gone out and visited someone and spent 2-3 hours with them and may have only identified some forms of abuse or spoken for about 20 minutes of that about the abuse directly. You know, they have a lot of information to share. It may have been 40-50 years that this abuse has been occurring. Older clients need to be believed, listened to, and to have their feelings validated. Seems obvious, but it's not a response that the women that I've spoken to have necessarily had. They described how at points they felt quite angry towards the response that they were receiving because they thought it was quite ageist or that they was getting a disservice. And this was then perceived that they were quite an aggressive individual and potentially that they were the perpetrator in this situation. But actually it was more of a frustration for not getting the appropriate support that they were wanting. So I think it's to recognize that there are a range of emotions that victims may project when engaging with services. Reframing repeat call outs. We found that the more the victim is calling help providers for assistance, particularly the police, the more they were building up the confidence to be able to leave and to access more formal support. But what we found is this disjuncture between the victims calling and engaging more, but the help provider is withdrawing because they're saying, oh, well, we know what this is going to happen. She doesn't want to leave. And they're becoming quite complacent towards it. And then the importance really of empowerment through individuals' rights and entitlements. This has really been key, that when they have knowledge of those rights and entitlements, how that positively influences that individual's help seeking. We do have a range of resources that are free on the website that you can have a look at and download for your own use, and further information on enablers. And there's the information for accessing those. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much for what's been a fascinating presentation, because it really has helped us to think about the dynamics and experiences and how for older victims and survivors of abuse, their experiences and the dynamics of the abuse are similar, but they are also qualitatively different for people later in life. So thank you for bringing that out so very clearly. We've now got approximately sort of 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Just because of the number of people who are in the webinar, we're asking you to put any sort of questions you might have into the chat function, because it'll be a bit easier just to make sure that people aren't talking over one another. But maybe to start off, while people are sort of composing their thoughts, could I ask maybe yourself, Rebecca, to start with? One of the things you've drawn out very clearly is the difference between the experiences of victims who are younger and older, but I wonder if there's anything coming through from the research and services with regards to whether or not older men versus older women, or older people who are in same-sex relationships versus different sex relationships, whether there's anything coming out which is about their experiences or their needs being slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely seen differences in terms of prevalence for older men. Our Access to Justice study, albeit a small sample, did show that a third of the cases involved an older male, and that's been reflected in our Dewis Choice initiative also. And when you compare this to younger age groups, it is significantly higher. We're not sure whether that's because there's more family members perpetrating that abuse, or whether it's something about them being more medicalized and those opportunities, or for it to be noticed, or for disclosures. We're not quite sure what those reasons are, but there is differences in terms of the response that they receive from services, kind of gendered expectations of who and how they should perform. With the LGBT aspect, we've just co-produced a short film with older LGBT victims that explores those differences. And we've also produced a practitioner film as well, which will be available at some point this year, which we've encapsulated practitioners' perspectives there, and the ways to address some of those additional barriers that they may face. So it's definitely not a one size fits all. And like you say, even the women, you know, we've seen they are spanning 3 generations. There are significant differences within those. It's like saying a 20-year-old's experience is the same as a 50-year-old's. They're not, but yet we assume that with older people that is the case with a 60-year-old compared to a 90-year-old. So I mean, I could do a whole presentation on male victims and LGBT as well, but I think that there is significant differences, and yeah, people can visit the website to find out more about those.
That's really helpful, Rebecca, and it's good to be starting to unpack some of the sort of similarities and differences, because as you've highlighted, it may require different types of responses moving forward, as opposed to just saying people as only having one characteristic, which is their age or their gender or their sexual orientation. That all of these are important considerations and thinking about the type of response which is most likely to be experienced as helpful by the individual.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Elizabeth, if maybe I could ask you that one of the striking things that came up in your one of your early slides was that some of the women who volunteered to be interviewed by you were talking really about their experience of one abusive relationship, where there were some of the other women who had experience of more than one abusive relationship. And I've been reading a PhD of a student in Norway at the moment who's been looking at that group of women who have had more than one relationship that's been abusive. And I wondered whether there was anything coming out of your research which might help us to understand better how to support women who find themselves in one abusive relationship and support them at that time, rather than sort of them finding themselves in another difficult relationship later in life. Because there was a sense from your research findings that there were some women who'd had one long relationship that was abusive over a long period of time, but others who had had different relationships which were problematic and maybe in different ways. So the strategies that worked in one situation might not be transferable to another. Don't know whether you have any reflections on that.
I spoke to a woman about that, the one who had 2, 3, 4 different relationships, and they blamed themselves. They thought they were a certain type. All the women I spoke to, they wanted to be in relationships. They wanted to have that, be able to, as Alison said, be able to share, be able to look after each other. I think some of these women are particularly vulnerable, and because they have been in one abusive relationship, this marvelous guy comes along, promises them the world, and they see their friends maybe in good relationships, they see other people, and they want that as well. I know I spoke to different organizations whenever I was doing the research, and women say they talked about how, and some of the women I spoke to had substance abuse problems. And women say talked about how perpetrators actually would go along to these meetings, and because they know that the women there are particularly vulnerable, and so they sort of share experiences with them. Say, oh yes, I know how you're what you're feeling, what you're going through. So I think it's, if the women start off in an abusive relationship, it's really difficult then for them. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. They are vulnerable. They want to find that Mr. Right, and then they blame themselves if they do. Say, am I sending off these signals? Am I stupid? Am I? But I think it's because perpetrators are very good at picking up signals of a woman that maybe is more vulnerable. The ones that were in their long-term relationships, they were there because because of Northern Ireland society and because of their families, they couldn't get out of them. Brenda was in a couple, Alison was in 4. Brenda says whenever she first met her second husband, he was lovely, he was the nicest guy you could meet, and because she just came out of another relationship. Alison actually spoke about how she realised she was having a relationship with this man online, and it took her a long time to realise that it was an abusive relationship there. He sort of asked her about her kids or about her family and this, that and the other. They talked a lot then over the weekend. and then it just suddenly disappeared again. But again, and then she was beating herself up. Yeah, why didn't I recognize that? Why didn't I know? I don't know how we can help women in that case. It's maybe sort of help empowering them, giving them strength to be able to say, if somebody is nice to them, that they don't have to accept that. They don't have to immediately fall into another relationship. The women that had several relationships seem just to bounce from one to the other. And I think they needed support there to help them just to stop and think before they went into another one.
Very helpful, Elizabeth, and it sort of reinforces some of the points from Rebecca's presentation as well about the need to try and ensure that services are as accessible as possible. As many now are very alert to the needs of victims right across the age range and who are in very different circumstances, so that individuals can be helped to reflect on what they've been through and develop strategies for the future, especially for if there are individuals who are predatory in the way that you've described, and looking for anybody who may appear vulnerable to take advantage of that. I'm just noticing that in the chat function, the chat function isn't actually working. So all my exhortations to sort of put all your questions there aren't working. So what I'm going to suggest in the few minutes that we've got left, if anybody does have a question, if you put your hand up, and I'll see if that we've got a way of, I think sort of I can allow you to talk. And I see Gemma, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to sort of experiment with you and see if we can sort of bring you in here at this point. So do you want to try, Gemma?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
John, I wanted to ask a question of Rebecca, actually. You know, she talked about human rights, and this is an area that's become increasingly important in terms of older people, given what we've seen, what's happened with the pandemic and everything. So I was wondering, had Rebecca experimented with how that would be operationalized if we did have a proper legal instrument? So we talk about protecting older people's rights, but it can be quite hard to actually make that happen. So I was just wondering if she thought about that. I'm not expecting her to have the full answer, but just to kind of have a think about it.
Thanks, Gemma.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good question, Gemma. And I think what we've seen is on the most basic level, those human rights have not been upheld. So they're not being asked, you know, what is it that you want in terms of access and justice and support. They're not being seen as capable of making those decisions for themselves. Often these kind of ageist stereotypes of, oh, they're older, they don't really know what's best for them, let's be paternalistic, and you know, going through the court process is going to be really hard. So I think it's just looking at the individuals on an individual basis and seeing, you know, how can we fully involve this person in this decision making, and what do we need to do to ensure that we're capturing their best wishes, but also their thoughts and feelings, regardless of whether they've you know, got living with dementia, for example, or there are some capacity issues there. I think it's about bringing that person right to the center of that decision making, and that response being truly person-centered and built around that individual. So I think we need to be doing that on a most basic level, in an individual level first, because we're not seeing evidence of that. I don't know if that's answered your question, Gemma.
No, that's great. That's great. But it's just what's striking me the more I think about this human rights issue is that we do need to work at the individual level, of course, and have cases, but we also need to see what happens to one older person as a structural problem, you know, that ageism at societal level, as you were saying. But no, it's great. We have a lot of work to do, don't we?
That's great. Thanks, Gemma, and thanks for that answer, Rebecca. Bridget Penhale. Bridget, you had your hand up a moment ago, so I'm not sure if you were wanting to come in at this stage.
Yeah, I was really just going to add something about the fact that there's work at international level around developing a convention on the human rights of older people. And one of the approaches that's been taken is to identify the gaps in terms of existing processes. And one of the areas that is sort of quite central to all of this is looking at situations of violence, abuse and neglect and exploitation of older people, in particular older women. So should a convention be developed, then we would be at a point where one of the articles, just as you have with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, would talk about the right to freedom from violence, abuse and neglect.
That's really helpful, Bridget. I think it reinforces a point, which is trying to see a range of behaviours as being sort of sitting alongside one another, being connected, being part of a continuum in some cases, but also trying to differentiate. I think both Elizabeth and Rebecca made this point between sort of what we might see as the response to elder abuse versus the response to domestic abuse, which might throw into question whether our response to elder abuse needs to change as well, to become much more empowering rather than paternalistic. Thanks for that. We've got a couple of minutes left if anybody else would like to come in. If you do, just put your hand up and then I'll try and spot that. But one of the questions that we got sent in beforehand, and maybe I'll turn to Elizabeth, since Elizabeth, you put together the seminar today, was from Michael Mansfield, and he was asking the question, the title is Hidden Voices. So does the panel agree that there should be at least one speaker who has direct experience and can break the taboo, otherwise the voices remain hidden? So it's very much about, should we be speaking on behalf of victims or putting victims front and center? It's not a critique of what you're doing today, but it is trying to sort of get us to think about, well, actually, how do we try and move away from this idea of people us not really seeing them when they're actually in plain sight? Elizabeth, do you have any reflections?
I actually, whenever I was first planning this event, I had been in touch with several women who were going to come along to the live event who had been victims of abuse. They weren't able to because obviously we had to go online. I do think it is really important that we hear. I mean, I tried as far as possible by using all the quotations so the women's voices themselves and speaking through my presentation. Maybe this wasn't the right forum for that, but I am hoping in future that I will be able to hold something similar to this, but and invite women who are willing. I mean, there are women out there who are willing to speak about the abuse, and I think it is really important that they get the opportunity first to speak for themselves, and also for other people to hear them directly, to hear their stories and their different experiences.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Elizabeth. And yeah, I think online events are presenting some greater challenges in terms of being able to sort of involve people in a way which is safe and supported, but it is that shouldn't be an sort of thinking forward. We need to think around that and think about how we sort of conquer some of those practical challenges. Conscious of time, so we've got a Maria Emilson McGoldrick. Maria, you wanted to come in and ask something of the panel or just make a comment?
I guess two things. I just want to make a comment on the back end of the kind of hearing the hidden voices. How do we bring them more in and for them to share stories? And I think, yes, it's a good start, but I think we have to be careful that we just don't use people to share the stories and they're leaving themselves quite exposed and we hear it, but then they have no input in what do we do with that. So I think we need to move even deeper into co-production and looking how we work with each other to develop and I guess improve our services in response to people who have experiencing harm in our society of all ages. So that was just my comment on that. But actually my question where I raised the hand in the first place was probably maybe to both Rebecca and to Elizabeth. Is it Elizabeth? Sorry, I'm really bad with names. It is in relation to your study and your kind of research in relation to sexual abuse within that context. Just thinking around how we see maybe the older population as sexual beings, as still being sexually active, and whether that created a barrier for disclosures or how, if you found anything around that.
Maria, it's definitely something that we've seen. We've done training with specialist independent domestic abuse workers, and they've even said how difficult they have found asking that question about sexual abuse. And these are, extremely qualified practitioners who ask these questions on a daily basis. But when it was somebody who was older, they felt unable to ask that question, particularly if there was a big age gap between them. The fact that because they're past the age of 60 that they're not having sex, I think is a big issue. One of our survivors was actually told that they couldn't do a recovery program. She was 62 because it was unlikely that she would have another relationship in later life. So there's lots of issues there with that, the sexual abuse being a barrier, and them actually disclosing that, having that opportunity to disclose. As I mentioned, it's been 6-7 months down the line before they've even told our workers who work intensively with that older person that they've experienced that form of abuse.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for a great question, and thanks, Rebecca, for showing that it is a very live issue in terms of both the lives of victims and also frontline services. I'm afraid we've come up to the end of our allocated time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to sort of draw things to a conclusion. Can I just thank, first of all, everybody who's turned up today to listen to our two fantastic presenters. I know everybody's lives are very busy, but it's great to see the level of interest in such an important topic. Next, can I thank Elizabeth and Rebecca for two very stimulating presentations, which were very different, but actually had lots of common themes running between them as well. So it's good to see that there's a real growing body of research that can help us sort of to bring to the fore the voices and experiences of men and women who are living with these experiences, but also starting to think about, well, what does that mean for how we help and support people to move to become survivors from what they've been through. And thanks to Paula, who's been working in the background and who has sort of through ARK at Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University hosted the webinar today. So thank you all. I think there'll be a follow-up email probably about the recording, but if you do have any email, sort of any reflections on the seminar, please do email in and let us know. But otherwise, best wishes for the rest of the day, and thank you again, Elizabeth and Rebecca, for taking the time to share your work with us today.